When most people think about what keeps Chinese leaders awake at night, they imagine external threats, American aircraft carriers, Japanese militarism, or Indian border disputes. But when I study Chinese strategic behavior through the lens of history, what becomes clear is that China's deepest fears are not about foreign invasion. They're about internal collapse. And this fundamental difference in nightmare scenarios between China and Russia explains much of what we're seeing in global politics today. You see, Russia and China have completely different historical traumas that shape their strategic thinking. Russia's nightmare scenario is other people invading Russia. The Mongol yoke in the 13th century, when the Golden Horde swept in and Russian elites became tax collectors for foreign masters, the devastation of Napoleon's invasion, the horror of World War I and World War II that left Western Russia in ruins. For Russians, the existential threat always comes from outside, from foreigners who want to dismember their empire and subjugate their people. But China's nightmare scenario is the complete opposite. China's greatest fear is not foreign invasion, but internal disintegration, the collapse of central authority, the return of warlordism, the fragmentation of the empire into competing regional powers. And this isn't some theoretical concern. This has happened to China repeatedly throughout its history, and each time it has led to centuries of chaos, civil war, and suffering that dwarfs anything foreign invaders have inflicted. Let me take you through why this matters so much to understanding Chinese behavior today. For over 2,000 years, Chinese political culture was organized around Confucianism, which provided a stable framework for governance that survived dynasty after dynasty. Rulers came and went, but Confucianism endured as the organizing principle for how Chinese society should function. It provided legitimacy through three essential pillars: ethical rule by virtuous leaders, economic prosperity for the people, and the maintenance of territorial integrity against barbarian invasion. But then came the 19th century and everything changed. China proved unable to defend itself against Western powers in the Opium Wars, unable to modernize effectively, unable to maintain the technological and military superiority that had characterized Chinese civilization for millennia. When enough Chinese ceased believing that Confucianism could protect them or provide effective governance, the entire system collapsed virtually overnight. The 1911 revolution didn't just change dynasties, it eliminated Confucianism as a viable organizing principle for Chinese government. What followed was exactly what Chinese leaders fear most: chaos. The warlord period, where regional military commanders carved up the country and fought endless civil wars. Foreign occupation by Japan, communist revolution, the insanity of the Cultural Revolution, where Chinese turned against Chinese in an orgy of ideological violence that killed millions and destroyed much of China's cultural heritage. For anyone who lived through that period, including Xi Jinping, the memory of chaos is more terrifying than any foreign threat. And this is why the Chinese Communist Party's relationship with ideology is so different from what most Westerners understand. They don't believe in communism in any meaningful sense. The economic theories that supposedly justify one party rule are obviously nonsense, and everyone knows it. But the party faces the same fundamental problem that destroyed Confucianism. How do you justify authoritarian rule when people no longer believe in the ideology that supposedly legitimizes your power? The party has tried to soldier on by shifting from one pillar of legitimacy to another as each one fails. Ethical rule? Gone. And everyone knows the party is thoroughly corrupt. Economic prosperity? Going fast as China's demographic collapse and debt crisis make sustained growth impossible. That leaves only the third pillar: territorial expansion and the defense of Chinese civilization against foreign enemies. This is where Chinese fears about internal collapse become really dangerous for the rest of the world. When you can't provide ethical government or economic growth, you turn to nationalism and external threats to maintain popular support. The Chinese Communist Party decided in the 1980s right after the Tiananmen massacre, to rewrite all the textbooks. Instead of focusing on class enemies, they would focus on external enemies, evil Japanese, evil Americans, anyone who could be blamed for China's problems. But here's the fatal contradiction in this strategy: nationalism is a very heady drink, and if you imbibe too much, it clouds your judgment. More importantly, for China's internal stability, it repels minority peoples within China's empire who have no interest in Han nationalism. When you make Han ethnic supremacy the basis for regime legitimacy, you guarantee that Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongols, and other minorities will become centers of resistance rather than integration. This helps explain the systematic genocide of the Uyghurs that's ongoing now. It's not just about cultural assimilation or economic development in Xinjiang. It's about preventing any possibility of the kind of minority breakaway that destroyed the Soviet Union. The Chinese leadership studied the Soviet collapse very carefully, and one of their key conclusions was that Gorbachev's fatal mistake was giving minorities a choice about whether to stay in the empire. When you give people that choice, they bolt. So China's approach is the opposite. Never give minorities that choice. Make resistance impossible through total surveillance, mass detention, forced sterilization, and cultural destruction. From the Chinese perspective, this isn't excessive brutality. It's preventive medicine against the kind of imperial fragmentation that could trigger complete internal collapse. The same logic applies to Hong Kong and Taiwan. These aren't just territorial disputes for Beijing, they represent alternative models of how Chinese people might organize themselves politically. Hong Kong's democratic protests and Taiwan's democratic success are existential threats to Communist Party legitimacy because they prove that Chinese people can govern themselves without authoritarian control. If those alternatives are allowed to flourish, they might inspire similar movements on the mainland. This is why Beijing's response to Hong Kong's democracy movement was so swift and brutal. They couldn't allow even a limited autonomous region to demonstrate that Chinese people could choose their own leaders and maintain prosperity and stability. The one country, two systems model had to be destroyed not because it threatened Chinese territorial integrity, but because it threatened the ideological foundations of Communist Party rule. Taiwan presents an even more serious version of the same problem. Here's a thriving democracy of Chinese people who have achieved prosperity, technological advancement, and international respect without Communist Party control. Worse yet, from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan's success makes it harder to convince mainland Chinese that authoritarian rule is necessary for Chinese prosperity and stability. But here's where China's internal collapse fears create a genuine strategic dilemma. The more aggressive China becomes in trying to eliminate these alternative models, the more it frightens neighbors into forming coalitions against Chinese expansion. The more it uses nationalism to maintain internal legitimacy, the more it repels potential partners and trading relationships that might actually strengthen China's economy and international position. The Chinese leadership understands this dilemma perfectly, which is why they've tried to calibrate their aggression carefully. Enough nationalism to maintain domestic support, but not so much that it triggers overwhelming international opposition. Enough pressure on Taiwan to prevent formal independence, but not so much that it provokes American military intervention. Enough repression of minorities to prevent separatism, but not so much that it becomes a major international issue. The problem is that this calibration becomes harder to maintain as China's other sources of legitimacy erode. As economic growth slows, as corruption scandals multiply, as the costs of the surveillance state increase, the party needs more and more external nationalism to distract from internal problems. This creates a ratchet effect where Chinese international behavior becomes steadily more aggressive over time. Xi Jinping represents the culmination of this logic. He's the first Chinese leader since Mao who has explicitly prioritized maintaining Communist Party control over economic efficiency when the two conflict. His crackdowns on tech companies, his zero COVID policies, his rejection of market reforms, all of these represent choices to sacrifice economic growth for political control. This makes sense if you understand that Xi's greatest fear isn't economic stagnation or even international isolation. His greatest fear is the loss of party control that might trigger the kind of internal chaos that has repeatedly devastated China throughout its history. Better to have a poorer but more controlled China than a richer but politically unstable China. But this strategy contains the seeds of its own destruction. By prioritizing control over effectiveness, by using nationalism to replace economic performance, by eliminating alternative models of Chinese governance, the party may be creating exactly the conditions that make internal collapse more likely rather than less. When you eliminate all feedback mechanisms, when you make it impossible for anyone to tell the leadership uncomfortable truths, when you sacrifice economic dynamism for political control, you create the kind of sclerotic system that eventually breaks under the weight of its own contradictions. This is exactly what happened to the Soviet Union, and it's what China's leaders are desperately trying to avoid. The tragic irony is that China's fear of internal collapse may be creating the very conditions that make such collapse inevitable. The surveillance state that's supposed to prevent resistance creates resentment. The nationalism that's supposed to unify the country alienates minorities and frightens neighbors. The economic controls that are supposed to maintain party power undermine the prosperity that originally legitimized that power. Meanwhile, the external threats that China uses to justify internal repression are becoming more real as Chinese behavior triggers defensive coalitions among its neighbors. The Quad, AUKUS, the strengthening of alliance relationships between the United States and its Asian partners, all of this represents the international system adapting to contain Chinese expansion in ways that may ultimately prove more threatening to Chinese interests than any internal democratic movement could have been. This is why I think China's nightmare scenario isn't some future possibility. It's a present reality that's unfolding in slow motion. The very strategies the Chinese Communist Party has adopted to prevent internal collapse are making that collapse more likely while simultaneously creating the external pressures that could trigger it. The question isn't whether China will face its nightmare scenario of internal disintegration. The question is whether the international system can manage that transition in a way that minimizes the global chaos such a collapse would create.